People think Bitcoin is decentralized and secure. I'm here today to tell you in this video that Bitcoin is absolutely not decentralized and it is not secure. G'day there, James here. And before we crack into Bitcoin, I want to give you a brief history of money. Money, currency, essentially, it is the same thing. So let's go back in time to 1668. Why is that year so special? What happened in 1668 was the first central bank was created. I'll give you three guesses. Which country you think created the central bank? If you're like me, you're probably thinking, well, maybe Rome, like Italy. Second guess might be Germany and then perhaps England. But no, they're all wrong. It was actually Sweden. Fascinatingly enough. Sweden, the Riksbank was the first central bank, and then from there was the Bank of England in 1694, and it actually wasn't the Rothschilds who started these central banks. Personally, I need to look into that a little bit more, but the Rothschilds took over after 1751 because that's when Nathan Rothschild was sent to England to start taking over the banking system. But before 1751, 1717 was a very important year for money in England, and it comes back to a man called Isaac Newton, who you probably know, and he's most famous for his theory on gravity, which is all just nonsense and it's distraction from what he actually did, which was the most important part of his life. Because what Isaac Newton actually did as a role, as a profession, later on in his years, he was the master of the Royal Mint for the Bank of England, and he changed the valuation of the ratios of silver and gold. And effectively what he did was push England from a silver and gold standard onto a gold standard. Well, why would England want to do that and later do that to America approximately 100 years later? Well, for the number one reason. Because silver is 15 times more populous than gold. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means that gold is much easier to hoard. And the one who is controlling the gold, which is viewed as money and currency with intrinsic value because people view that and they believe that and they have trust and confidence that gold and silver will be accepted as a form of currency wherever they go, he who is controlling the gold, the money, will control everything else. So they want to easily hoard the gold and devalue and demonetize silver as a currency. But they didn't do that straight away. In 1717 they did that in England, but it took a while for it to happen in America. And why are we talking about England, America? Because that's where a lot of these roots are caused from. That's where they're coming from, the sources of all this central banking system. So when we look at history, we can see the transition to silver and gold, then to gold, and then to total no gold standard and just money printing, fractional reserve lending out of thin air. But the best monetary system we've seen so far, which really is still not a good monetary system, but it's the best, is where a government will create its own fiat currency. Not backed by gold or silver or anything of tangible real value. It's just trust and confidence that these pieces of paper have value. And this is what America was doing in the 17 and 1800s. They had many different names and there was actually many different currencies circulating in the States over this time period of a couple hundred years. But one of the most famous and well-known names for this currency is called the Continental. And this was actually before Abraham Lincoln and his perhaps more famous greenback. You may have heard of that. So what actually sparked the American Revolution in 1773? It wasn't an increase in taxes and the import tariffs of tea, which is one of the common primary reasons that mainstream media and history say it was the tea taxes and they wanted to fight back. Well, no, it wasn't really that. It was the three currency acts that were passed in 1751, 1764 and 1773. And what those currency acts in effect were doing was pushing America onto a gold and silver standard. Why were they doing that? Because they didn't want the government issuing currency. Why wouldn't they want that? Well, because the central banks want to issue their currency with debt, with interest. Why would they want to do that? So then whoever's borrowing from them, governments and any other private individual, are in debt to those bankers. They can make a fortune from doing nothing but perpetuating the biggest scam. Oh, that's a big one, is it? Would you call it the biggest scam? Oh, well, definitely up there. It's one of the biggest scams in human history, is central banks, fractional reserve lending, lending out money at interest, creating it from thin air, or having just a small 5–10% of tangible real assets like gold or silver or anything else, and then fractional reserve lending where you can lend out 10–20 times more than what you actually have in reserves. This is a terrible, terrible system. And so these currency acts to move the Americans and the governments who were uncorrupted by central bankers at this point, they're still obviously corrupt because they're governments, but they were far, far less corrupted than they were today. So they wanted to move them away from government-issued fiat currency to get them onto a gold and silver standard, because the central bankers were able to hoard and control most of the gold and silver. So it made it a lot easier for them to control the money supply and to continue fractional reserve lending. And then over the years, we started off at 1717 with Isaac Newton changing the value ratio of gold and silver. So then he got rid of the silver as a standard and as a primary currency in England. But that only happened in America after the Revolution in 1873, which was the Coinage Act, which was saying that essentially you couldn't use silver to pay off public and private debt. So it was demonetizing silver. But before that, in 1791 to 1811, there was a 20-year bank charter for the first central bank of America. Because most people don't know, there's been 3 central banks in America. Obviously, the latest one is the Federal Reserve, and that was instituted in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. That was passed at Christmas time with no one around to oppose it. And you can go into a tangent about the Titanic, how that was an assassination attempt of 3 powerful men who would have opposed and stopped the Federal Reserve Act from going through. After the first central bank, the charter ran out. In 1811, the central bank wasn't renewed. It didn't go around for round 2 for 5 more years. There were some other politicians who had the decency to oppose it. But after 5 years, the central bankers managed to sway the governments around through the methods that they typically use: extortion, blackmail, trickery, deception, etc. And a second central bank was instituted. And that lasted for another 20 years until Andrew Jackson came along, a president of America, and he vehemently opposed the bank, and he delayed them for approximately 70–75 years, because the second central bank of America was 1816 to 1836, and then its 20-year charter ran out, essentially because Andrew Jackson was opposing them. So if we fast forward another approximately 25 years, we come to Abraham Lincoln's time and the Civil War. So Abe needed a way to fund the war, to unite the North and the South. So what he did was he copied what America had done in the past with Continentals issuing their own currency. So he created the famous greenback. And that only lasted for a few years, but it was going strong, it was going well when it was working. But one of the main tactics that England started instigating against America to unbalance and create more disorder in the country that they wanted to have more control over, even though it was a civil war, they always had their hands in everything, right? We know that. A very powerful war tactic was that the English sent people over to America to counterfeit the currency. And when you're counterfeiting it, what's happening? Well, you're creating inflation. And when you create inflation, what happens to the dollars that are already circulating in the economy amongst the people? Well, it devalues, it's worth less. So counterfeiting is a capital crime. Like it's a very bad thing to do. If we were to create our own currency, they'd call it counterfeiting, but they have the legal right to do it every day in absolute maddening excess. So the greenbacks didn't stay in circulation and didn't stay popular for long because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. So he wasn't around for very long, but he did something very great, which was introducing the greenbacks to try and give power back to the American people after all the catastrophe that the English introduced to America with those three currency acts in 1850s to 1873, approximately, of pushing the Americans onto a gold and silver standard. And then we fast forward after the Civil War, after Abraham Lincoln dies, 8 years after, 1873, that's when the Coinage Act came into effect, which pushed the silver away because the Americans were mining and they were finding a lot of silver in America. So, which meant there was more money that was going into the supply, and America was doing very well at that time. And it's different compared to inflation through counterfeiting and just printing on demand, because it was a reasonable amount of inflation that was happening. It was measured. You can't just pull up thousands of tons of silver every day, but you can print thousands of tons of money every day. So the English didn't like that the Americans were using silver. They essentially banned silver and pushed everyone onto a gold standard. Why? Again, because they can hoard the gold so very easily. And the story gets worse as we continue on down the years. We know the central bank succeeded for a more permanent length of time in 1913 with the Federal Reserve. Now the year is 2024, believe it or not. So, wow, that's 111 years that the Federal Reserve, wow, that's shocking, isn't it? That it's been around for that long and no one's been able to stop it. It's awful, it's bloody awful. When you compare it to the two first central banks, which were only around for 20 years a pop. This is what, 5, almost 6 times longer in duration that this central bank has been in existence. 1933, Franklin Roosevelt, Executive Order 6102. Do you know what that was? That was when they stole all the Americans' gold. They said, hand it in. You're not allowed to have it anymore. It's for the collective good of everyone that we look after it. We set the prices. We are in control. The government, the central bank, the Federal Reserve. If you didn't hand in your gold and you got caught, well, it was either a $10,000 fine at that time, which was a lot more than the equivalent of today because of inflation, or 10 years imprisonment, or most likely both. So people were terrified, so they handed in their gold, and then the Americans changed the valuation and the price of the gold, and then essentially they sold it all to other countries because most of the gold was meant to be stored in Fort Knox. But they don't do any audits anymore, which is surprisingly stupid because they easily could have fabricated audits and continued to deceive the American population by saying that Fort Knox was full of gold, it's okay, we've got it, we've got the reserves, you know, it's a good thing. But they just totally ignored it and said, oh, we're not doing audits, forget about that. And so the theory is that Fort Knox is actually empty because if it wasn't, they'd be able to prove it. And they sold all the gold probably to England and Germany and other countries, maybe perhaps in Switzerland with the BIS, the IMF and the World Bank. Those are the central banks of the central banks, essentially. They probably control most of the physical gold and silver. Well, actually, you look it up, they do. So that's just another piece of evidence that gold is not a good form of money. It is not a good store of value. Why? Because it can be easily stolen by people and hoarded. Because the most valuable, perhaps not valuable, the most powerful thing that you can do with money. Do you know what the most powerful thing your money can buy you? Have a couple guesses, but I'll tell you right now. The most powerful thing your money can buy is thugs. Thugs. Men at arms. Weapons. That's the most powerful thing money can buy you. Because imagine if men were actually honourable and incorruptible and intelligent. You wouldn't be able to buy anyone with money. Therefore, you couldn't have any kind of monopoly. It would have no central banks. Because the only reason these governments and central banks are able to prosper and survive is because they use money to pay thugs to protect them. That's the most powerful thing your money can ever buy. Well, perhaps until in the future when you can buy AI and robots. It's just a different form of thuggery though, isn't it? Same thing essentially. So after 1933, you had the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement where lots of countries got together and said they were going to use gold as a standard, as a backing for their central bank systems, but that didn't last too long because then you come to 1971 with Richard Nixon where they totally removed the gold standard. And they said you cannot redeem your currency or your fiat paper notes, whether it's a promissory note or bill of exchange or demand note, etc. There's lots of different names for these notes. Let's just call them fiat currency, right? The paper receipts. You wouldn't be able to exchange that for gold anymore, gold or even silver. And from that point, it was purely based upon faith, based upon nothing, the money supply. But not in a good way or a better way where the governments of the past, of Abe Lincoln and the other governments even before there, were the Continentals, the Greenbacks, where the government was issuing the currency with no debt. Because what happens now, essentially, the government goes to the central bank and says, hey, here, I'm going to give you a different analogy. Let's say I go to the bank, right? Just any normal bank. And let's say whoever's watching, your name is Bill. And I say to the banker, hey, can I borrow out $10,000 in Bill's name, which is you, okay? And if you're a woman, you're called Susan. So Bill or Susan. And the banker says, yeah, sure, no worries. Okay, but if you don't repay it, we're going after them. We're going after Bill or Susan to get that $10,000. I say, yeah, no worries, that's fine. It doesn't bother me. You're not coming after me, you're going after them. You know, so okay, yep, I'm signing as Bill or Susan, and I'm giving authority to you, the banker, and your thugs, obviously, because the money buys thugs, to attack Bill or Susan, you, to get that money back if I don't repay it. So essentially that's what happens today, right? The government goes to the central bankers. Can we borrow money? Yeah, okay, sure, here's the money, right? We give you $10,000, but you have to pay us back $20,000. You know, when you're talking in banking terms for governments, it's billions and billions, you have to pay us back trillions and trillions, essentially. The central bank only accepts that agreement because the government says, hey, we'll pay it back through taxes. And what is taxation? It's just robbery, it's theft, it's armed assault and theft. If the people that the government is borrowing the money from the central bank in their names, don't repay the debt, then the thugs will go after them. You, me, everyone else that is not paying the debt of the politicians. So the politicians are getting a loan. They're the ones who are asking for it from the central bankers, the Rothschilds and whoever else. They are asking for the loan. They're getting it in the public's name and saying that if the public doesn't repay this debt that the politicians are asking for, then thugs can attack the public and make them repay the politicians' debt. And if they don't, they can imprison them, kill them, take all their stuff, whatever. Any form of violence is not only acceptable, but necessary and noble, because it's a noble thing to repay your taxes. But if you're watching this video, you're probably well aware that taxation is theft. Not going to go over that. That's very, very obvious at this point. And if it's not, go back and watch my other videos about taxation in the series about comparing policies to principles, how a government should really work, and then why a government can never actually work. So if we look at the big timeline, the big picture, we can see over the past 300 years or so, since 1717, what the cabal has done has pushed the population, society, civilization onto gold and silver, then away from silver onto gold, and then even away from gold onto fractional reserve lending and just no reserves, no backing, just print on demand, and then into digital printing on demand, where it's even more cost effective for them because they don't have to pay for the facilities and the staff and the printing press and the paper to make the money, right? They can just type it into a computer today. So we look at that and we can come to Bitcoin and we can see that evolution. Why this is going to be even more powerful for them, more centralizing, more insecure for us the people. Why have they done it? Why have they created Bitcoin as a control mechanism? Because money is the ultimate control mechanism of humanity. It is, that's just a fact. It's also a necessary thing for societies and civilizations to thrive and prosper, because what is money? Money acts as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and it's a unit of account. These are the three primary characteristics of what money actually is, and then you can go into some secondary characteristics like durable, portable, fungible, divisible, acceptable, etc. So we recognize the unfortunate truth that money is a necessity to society, because when you're trying to figure out how to create a society without money, whoa, my goodness, that is next to impossible. If you really want to create a society without money, you're going to need money to be able to do it. That's just the way the world is. Okay, we accept that. That's a fact of reality. It is what it is. Money, like everything else, needs to be as simple as possible. Bitcoin, you have to realize that if it only takes 51% of the miners to be able to control the entire blockchain and Bitcoin, whether you can send money or you can't, whether it's blocked, right? Because you need the miners to verify and be able to confirm transactions to send it from me to you. If the miners don't do that, I can't send money from my Bitcoin account, my wallet, to yours. So if a system requires 51% control, how can you not recognize that the cabal, like that, can control 51%? They can control 90%, and they do. How could they not? They have unlimited, literally unlimited, fiat currency at their disposal. They can buy the land. They can buy the huge sheds that are necessary for these Bitcoining farms, because if you don't know how Bitcoin creation and the transactions occur, it's through Bitcoin farms. It's through these machines called ASICs. And the ASICs are application-specific integrated circuits. All it means, it's just basically a very powerful computer that only mines Bitcoin. And the mining of Bitcoin, it's a system that computates, well, it doesn't even computate, it's guessing a hash. It's guessing a specific number to be able to verify the transaction. And the more of these ASIC machines that are in the system, on the network, then the harder the algorithm gets to guess. And so when you look at reality, you look at the world, the cabal already owns most of these Bitcoin farms.
Bitcoin hit $1 trillion market cap this year. This has inspired some Bitcoin operations to expand, especially in the wake of the recent government crackdown of miners in China.
The ban on mining in China has caused a mass exodus to the United States, to Russia, and to any other areas where mining facilities are available.
Welcome to Rockdale, Texas, America's new crypto mining hub.
This building that's directly behind me, inside of the buildings, we have this shelving that's 1,000 feet long, 20 feet tall, and there are just miner after miner after miner after miner.
We went inside North America's largest Bitcoin mine to understand how it works and its energy footprint.
What is a miner? It is a small computer. They call it an ASIC miner. It is made to solve problems, and when they solve that problem, it feeds into the Bitcoin network. When it feeds into the Bitcoin network, you receive a reward.
To help us understand crypto's reward system a little better, we spoke to blockchain expert Bettina Warburg.
That's what mining is. It's a process by which people are contributing computing power and earning a reward for essentially participating in this process that secures a network. Everybody's using the same software that allows them to connect together and participate in a governance structure that's shared.
It seemed like only yesterday that one person with a handful of computers crunching numbers in their apartment could make money from mining Bitcoin. So how do we go from there to here?
Just like with many industries, you start small. The guy in the garage started the process. He mined Bitcoin. I believe the reward was around 50 Bitcoin for every block reward. Now it is at 6.25.
In some ways, cost equals energy expenditure. This is just the nature of technology. We see updates and innovation and people driving margin and driving their cost of operation down in order to reap the greatest reward. So you get mining operations that happen in places where power is less expensive.
Typically, mining operations go where energy is cheap. Right now, Texas has some of the lowest kilowatt-hour prices in America. That's due in part to a deregulated energy market, which means several providers compete to snag big customers like Windstone.
So there's environments like Iceland, Russia, China, Canada. Areas like Iceland and Canada have a cooler environment. There's probably less dust in those areas. The miners run at a cooler temperature.
Cryptocurrency is about the low-cost provider. Texas is becoming a hotbed for other cryptocurrency facilities.
In fact, Shenzhen-based bit mining is coming to Texas, and Beijing-based Bitmain, a company that designs circuit chips for Bitcoin mining, is moving into the decaying aluminum plant down the road from Windstone. According to the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education, $1 worth of Bitcoin takes 17 megajoules of energy to mine. That's more than double the amount of energy it took back in the day to mine $1 worth of copper, gold, and platinum.
The machines require more power, and more power requires larger capacity, bigger transformers, higher voltage.
Ultimately, the energy intensiveness comes from the fact that solving these mathematical puzzles is challenging, and you have to expend a certain amount of compute power against it to be the fastest one to actually solve the puzzle. And putting as much computational energy into that challenge as possible increases your ability to actually win. It's intentionally inefficient.
Each building is 100 megawatts. For each 100 megawatt building, you can fit 30,000 new ASIC miners in it. In a Bitcoin mine, the consumption is basically taken by the miners. Each miner has about 3,000 watts that it's pulling. An older miner, an older generation, the S9, which was released in September 2017, was only pulling 1,350. The miners now are at 3,000.
So, at capacity, this facility will have 750 megawatts of electricity flowing through it, enough to power 150,000 Texas homes during peak demand. That's a lot of juice. How do they manage to keep all those miners cool?
Our ideal goal is to keep the ambient temperature around 81 degrees. There's a lake about a mile from here, and so underground we have a 8-inch line with 1,000 GPM pump where we pump literally the water through this mile-long pipe into the facility, and it actually goes into holding tanks that then recirculate the water, and it pumps it back into these evaporative cooling walls that are 12 feet tall. Water is actually dripping down the wall of that evaporative cooling cell, and then as the air comes through it, it actually cools from 16 to 20 degrees difference between the front of the wall and the inside of the wall. The miners have fans, they have intake fans, and there's thousands of those fans running, and they actually suck the ambient air through the miner, and then there's an exhaust fan that actually pushes the air through the chips and into the heat aisle. As it goes through the miner, it then heats up because the chips, it's a processing, so it gets really hot, and then we capture the heat on the inside of the heat wall, and then it is evacuated out of the building through a quote-unquote chimney-like environment.
Inside the heat aisle, it literally feels like an oven. One Windstone employee estimates that it can get as hot as 140 degrees Fahrenheit in here.
So the S9 has a hash rate of 13.5 terahash. The new S19s are 110 terahash.
Hash rate measures how many computations a miner can do, usually in a second. So how much money can each miner potentially make each day?
Currently, a S19 with 110 terahash, the profitability every day for one machine is 30 USD.
Okay, so $30 times 30,000 miners times 2 big buildings, nearly $2 million a day for a facility this size.
We have a full staff of 120 employees. We work 24 hours a day, 3 shifts.
There are definitely some increased efficiencies on the horizon, such as faster processing chips for the miners, cooling them in immersion technology, but at approximately 73 terawatt hours annually, Bitcoin's energy consumption is more than the energy it takes to run every single television set in America.
I think ultimately the energy consumption question is a bit of a what is it relative to? When we look at our financial system as a whole, or even just Wall Street, to power Wall Street, which runs almost entirely off of computation today anyway, and high frequency trading algorithms. When you look at mining just to earn Bitcoin, well, that's not necessarily so awesome.
According to the Digiconomist's Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index, one Bitcoin transaction takes more than 1,500 kilowatt hours to complete. That's more than 50 days of power for the average US household.
Bitcoin is what I like to think of as a calculator. So it's this sort of old school, very clunky system that gets the job done. When you look at what's happened with newer blockchains like Ethereum 2 and Definity, is that they've actually implemented a totally different system for essentially doing the same thing. And Ethereum is upgrading to a more energy efficient way of securing the network. And the future will be about a lot of these different internet computers battling it out for adoption. So you'll see Definity, Near, Flow, Polkadot, all kinds of networks really serving as the optimized internet computers. Ultimately, the value will come from the amount of applications and tools and things that you can build and do on top of this computing architecture. You know, I think all technology creates energy consumption in certain patterns, and ultimately what we have to do is make sure that what we're building is something that's worthwhile and that we actually want in our society.
Because they can afford, again, the land, the sheds, the cooling systems, because these machines get very, very hot, and the insurance on these machines, the machines themselves, the machines are not cheap, they're expensive, thousands and thousands of dollars. They're getting cheaper now, but some of them initially were between $20,000 to $50,000 when Bitcoin mining first began, when Bitcoin came into existence. So how can a system be decentralized if you only require 51% of the miners to be able to control the network? You don't have to believe me on that 51%. Research it, find it out yourself. And then how can you possibly say that Bitcoin is decentralized? And people may try and argue and say, well, it's not just one company that owns all these miners. There's lots of different companies. There's hundreds or maybe even thousands of different small companies that own this mining farm here in this country, and then in this state, and then in that country. We could say that perhaps it is at the moment, for the next, whoever knows, months or years at this point, more secure than having your money in a bank, because we know that's absolutely centralized, having your fiat dollars in a bank, and that's absolutely insecure because the bank can block transactions, take money out of your account at any time. At least it is a little bit harder with Bitcoin if you've got a self-custodial wallet and if you can control the keys. But the insecurity about that comes in if your name, your wallet address gets blacklisted, then it's totally insecure because you won't be able to spend your money. Because anytime you go to spend your money, it needs to go to the blockchain to get confirmed by the miners. And the cabal owns all the mining systems. So if you're blacklisted, they just say, no, you know, your money isn't going to this person you're buying a house from, a car from, a hammer from, a tea towel, a bag of lemons, whatever. They just won't let your account send. And you think, well, maybe why don't I just send my money into a different wallet? Well, then they won't let you do that. Or if you do already have a different wallet, they can just figure that out, because the secondary negative aspect about Bitcoin is that it's public. It's worse than the current banking systems, how it works. If I send money to you to pay for a back rub because I want a neck massage, but I don't want anyone else to know, well, no one else apart from the bank will know that I've sent money to you. But in Bitcoin, if I pay you for a back massage, right? Everyone in the world can know, because you can go online and you can see that. And sure, it's not my name and your name, it's wallet addresses, but anyone who has the technological know-how can easily identify who is making those transactions. It's totally to the public eye. Really, you could say it is worse than fiat currency we have today, because at least with fiat currency today, we have physical cash, and that gives you an extra layer of privacy. But the answer to Bitcoin and currency is not cash, because start to think about that. Just think about it for an hour, how you'd possibly implement that. Because if you can't create a currency for the world as a whole, it's not going to be a good currency. It's too difficult to actually use and implement. And then you have those problems of counterfeiting, which will inflate your currency. You got the problem of they can easily send thugs to stop machines that are printing your money. Cash, unfortunately, it just doesn't work. It's outdated. We can't use it in this world. We need a digital currency moving forward, an alternative. And obviously Bitcoin fluctuates. It has no fixed value. It goes up and down all the time. As of today, I think one Bitcoin is resting around 90,000 Australian dollars or so. And so perhaps you could look at that as an investment if you want to make fiat currency in the moment, which, look, I do understand. I do see the reason and the value in that. But as a currency should not be fluctuating with that much volatility. Realistically, a currency should maintain and hold its value. So Bitcoin is not the answer. The answer is an alternative that is truly decentralized, that if you were going to control it, you would need 100% of the network, of everyone's phones or laptops, of the technology. You need a total 100%. And it needs to be stable with a fixed value, and it needs to be peer-to-peer with no centralizing protocol. I'd love to hear from you, get some feedback, see what you think, if you've got any other ideas, especially ideas of creating a new alternative currency. So I hope you've enjoyed. Bye-bye.